Koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this webinar on our Network Environmental Performance Report 23-24. My name's Tim Cadogan. I'm an engagement specialist here at Taumata Arowai, and it's a great pleasure to welcome so many people to this webinar. We're actually just quietly chuffed, I have to say, because for the first time ever, we've cracked 100 people have said they're coming. I don't know how many we're going to get yet. We're halfway there. But it's just really gratifying with the huge amount of work that's gone in, not just from staff here at the Water Services Authority, Taumata Arowai, but also from council staff who have helped put together the documents that this report leans into. Now, before we go any further, it would be appropriate if I were to start us off with karakia. So let's get that underway. Kia hora te marino, kia whapapapa punamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa, hui e tauiki e. May the peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for all of us this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, and bind us together. So as I say, it's great to have you all here today, and we have a number of speakers who will come to us shortly. Just tonight, though, there will also be, I'm sure, a number of questions. So please, if you do have questions, pop them in the Q&A. I believe the chat has been disabled so that we don't wind up with two streams of questioning. So questions, please, in the Q&A. And just we will be taking a break sort of at the 20 to 25 minute mark to take questions then, just to break things up a bit. And then, of course, at the end, there'll be time for more party at that stage. So the people who'll be presenting today on the part of the authority are Dr. Sarah McFall. She's the Head of Systems Strategy and Performance, Ed Yong, Senior Technical Advisor, Molly Carruthers, Data and Insights Analyst, and Heather Griffiths, Senior Advisor, Systems Reporting. So with no further ado, we'll get into it, and I'll invite Dr. Sarah McFall to take over. Kia ora, Sarah.
Thanks, Tim. Kia ora koutou. Thanks so much for joining us. I think it should be a really good session. We're going to dig into the data in some detail, and we've got the technical experts on the call to talk through that and to answer any questions. I'm just going to cover off a few sort of introductory slides before we get into the really interesting stuff. As Tim mentioned, this is the Network Environmental Performance Report. It's our second NEPR, and I think you'll see that we have better data this year than last year and have been able to draw some more conclusions and tell quite an interesting story. This slide just talks through the purpose of the report and also the statutory requirements that sit underneath it. This report is really important for providing the public with a national level view of their water services and the environmental performance of their networks. So we're really delighted to be able to publish this for the second time. And as everyone knows, having a really good understanding of our water networks through really good transparent information is a critical step to improving their performance, managing risks to the environment and to public health, and being really resilient for the future. And we'll talk a bit more about what we found in those regards. This is just kind of showing what we mean by environmental performance. We've used quite a broad definition there. So I talked before about we look at the impact on the environment and public health and how the state of our networks directly impacts public health, but it's broader than that. And so we look at efficiency, reliability, resilience, and economic sustainability. And we've got sections in our report that cover off all those elements. And we think it's really important to have that broad definition because a poorly maintained network and one that is not sufficiently invested in or not ready for resilience or future growth is more likely to fail, and that will have that knock-on effect on the environment and public health. So we see it all really connected, and that's why we have quite a broad view of what we mean by environmental performance. So as we have mentioned, this is our second NEPR, and this just shows a bit of the sort of journey we've been on and the journey we continue to be on. Last year, we reported on drinking water measures, This year we have more drinking water information, and we're reporting on our first set of wastewater measures. And next year we will have more information about wastewater. We have some high-level information about stormwater in the report, but we don't yet have any measures. We haven't consulted with the sector yet on what those might look like. So that will be part of future work. And the other thing we're really aware of is that while the sector is also on a sort of data journey, we are too, and we're looking at ways to make reporting easier, clearer, how we collect it in a more streamlined way, and working alongside Commerce Commission and the Department for Internal Affairs to make sure we're as joined up as we can be, so we're not being duplicative or asking 3 times for the same information. So that's work we'll be working with the sector on really actively over the next year. So today, before I pass on to members of the team who are going to take you through the data in much more detail, I'll just sort of cover off what we're going to be talking about today. But before I do that, as Tim mentioned at the beginning, the reason we can publish this report is because of the data that is provided to us by you and your teams. We are really grateful for the efforts that people go to do this for us. It's really important, as I said, for the public to have this information and to share it back with the sector. And this year we were really encouraged by improvements in the data, giving us a much better picture of performance. And also a big thanks to our team. Some of them are on the call today and we'll be talking soon, but there are a lot of people who go into collecting the data, analysing the data, making sure it's okay, checking many times to make sure it's as accurate as it can be, and actually writing the reports. A lot's gone into that, and we're really proud of this report, and we're really grateful to the work of the teams in doing that. So big shout out to them. We think the report tells a really interesting story this year. We hope you do too. And it's giving us some ideas for trends we'll be monitoring in years to come. So before we kind of get into some of those key themes, we're going to talk about how we actually use your data and how we check on its quality. Molly's going to take us through that aspect. And then Ed and Heather are going to talk about the key findings this year and our recommendations. For me, the report really brought home the importance of the critical nature of the infrastructure challenges that we're all facing. Like last year, we have seen that the poor condition of some of our networks is really impacting the environment and public health. We're losing more water than we should, certainly in some areas, and you'll see we have some information about water takes and then water loss as well. And I think that is highlighting challenges that we will be having to deal with over the next few years, particularly as you see the data we have on expiring water take consents. We've got a bow wave of those coming up for renewal in the next 10 years. And obviously, as we look at population growth and new development and climate change, we can see the data telling us that we have a really serious challenge. So I think the report is part of that narrative that we're hearing about in other places too, and a really important contribution to that. So I'm now going to hand over to the team, who are the real experts on the content of these reports, to take you through what we found and how we used your data. So thank you very much. I'm handing over to Molly.
Sorry, kia ora, thank you, Sarah. We are going to move into having a quick look at the data quality from the report last year. Oh, I think.
There you
go. So I am a data and insights analyst at Taumata Arowai, and I have done the bulk of the work in the NEPR last year and also will be again this year. We could have the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the submission of your data. This is just an overview of what we do with this data that we receive from network operators when we get it, usually about the 30th of September. So we receive the email submission of the template, and that then goes into a custom designed data engineering pipeline. Some things happen to that to validate it, and then it goes through to our central database. We can then take that data from the central database, put it into other programs like Power BI and Python, do lots of things to it, transform it, check for errors, check for formatting, all that kind of thing. That data is taken from there. We then move on to the analyzing stage, where we can then inform the narrative of the report through the insights and the data that we generate. Data quality. So this one is a big one for us. Based off of last year's data, the data quality is definitely improving, and we like to consider all the aspects, the 7 aspects of data quality. So integrity, accuracy, completeness, consistency, validity, timeliness, and uniqueness. Some of the key aspects we noticed in the data from the past NEPR was that completeness, accuracy, and consistency were some areas for significant improvement. So less than 60% of operators reported on some key measures, so residential water use, pressure, and water loss. We had a large number of outliers in the data, particularly towards the very extreme end of what you'd expect for certain things like water use, water loss, and ILI. And we also noticed that in the methodology that was stated to calculate things like the asset condition, that varied a lot, and we're trying to encourage more consistency in the standardization of the ways in which people are calculating things, especially in the context of asset management. So this year we also did a external verification of a selection of 20 councils. So those 20 councils spanned across the range of population densities in New Zealand. So we had metro councils, rural councils, and provincial councils in that group. And we wanted to review the key measures on asset condition and water loss. So the feedback from that review was that about half of the operators wanted to resubmit their data because there was inaccuracies within there. That meant that we then allowed all network operators to resubmit their data, and about 31% took us up on that opportunity. We also noticed that the confidence ratings needed a little bit of assistance to be improved in their accuracy, and about 80% of network operators were recommended to update their confidence rating. And again, as with our data quality assessment, there was a large variety of methods for assessment of asset condition in those 4 key measures that were reviewed by Morpham Environmental. Kia ora, thank you. I'll hand on to Ed Yong, who is our Senior Technical Advisor, Asset Management.
Thank you. As Molly said, I'm Ed Yong. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor, Asset Management. And if we could have the next slide. So I'm here to talk to you about what we found out in the report with key findings against asset management and then water loss and then eventually pressure management. So this slide just kind of highlights what the state or how many assets we have in the water sector. As you notice, there is no stormwater section, even though we have some data from the NTU. Unfortunately, due to asset class, non-standardized asset classes, we couldn't really summarize that information. So we're only going to be able to provide information about drinking water and wastewater. The big takeaway from this is that there has been a lot more reporting this year. So you can see that there's been 26% more pipes graded, 14% more network operators having assessed critical assets, and then 7% more network operators having a water conservation program. Next slide. When we look at the assets, the biggest thing that we want to think about is the condition of the assets. So we asked about conditions for above ground assets and also all the pipeline assets. Here it is in the comparison. You can see we do have more knowledge about the pipe assets rather than the above ground assets. So it kind of gives you an impression that there's a lot more understanding about what's below ground than above ground. And then there's also a division between the different population densities, where you can see that the metro has more understanding of their assets than the rural. This could be due to various factors such as more resources, more ability to understand, more asset maturity. It can factor into a lot of different things. But if we go to the next slide, since we know the most about the water network piping assets, we wanted to show you as a representation of lengths of pipe. Now, please note that there are some issues with what Molly said before about how there's multiple methodologies to calculate the condition. So comparison is not always easy because some might be based on desktop assessments while others might be based on actual physical assessments. But this is the best representation that we could get. So here it is saying how metro networks have a lot more pipes than all the other population densities and also has a lot more information about their pipes, but it does have a higher amount of pipes in poor condition. Again, this is very representative. We don't know if it's due to not having a lot of information because the provincial and rural population density networks didn't have a lot of information available or didn't fully assess all their assets, or is it because of the volume of pipes that is actually in the metro network? So that's kind of the thing that we're trying to look for when we get more reporting done and more data comes in. We are going to try to standardize, well, not standardize, but ask you about how you're generating the data and how you're collecting the data this year so that we can actually figure out and compare the values a little bit better. So from poor condition, we can go to the next slide to talk about water loss. So when we have poor condition in networks, it usually leads to water loss. One of the biggest things that we're trying to do is use the infrastructure leakage index to measure water loss rather than using percentages or like a volume. This really helps because it normalizes all the data so that we can actually compare smaller networks with larger networks. And as you can see from this map, there are a scattering of different colors across the country. From the water loss and the ILI, we only had 54% of the networks providing us data. And that's just a little over half, which paints a picture about needing more maturity in the asset management field so that we can get the water loss calculated. And also 8% of these data points were erroneous because the standard value for ILI usually sits between around 1 to max 8, but you can also go up to 40. But we had ranges of around 0.001 going to 100,000. So that's why we thought there were some erroneous numbers. And when we were looking through the data, we found that 32% of the operators that reported a ILI had at least one network that was in poor condition. Now, water loss is really important to manage because it has a lot of ramifications. Sometimes when you're looking at extractions, you might think, oh, well, I have a lot of water in my network. I have a lot of sources of water. I'm water rich. That can change with climate change, emergencies, other things could happen. You could lose that ability or have that water surplus. Another thing that could happen is contamination. If you have low pressure and low flow in your network, there could be ingress of contaminants into it from the leakage, and you could have a health risk. The final thing is you could actually have issues with planning your assets for long-term strategies. Say you have a high water loss, and then you're not knowing that, you could end up saying, well, we need more treatment, build a new treatment plant, but that could have been resolved by just fixing all the leaks. That is something that we need to take into consideration when we're looking at water loss. And that's why it's really important to get on top of managing water loss. Next slide. So one of the biggest takeaways we also want to show you is that our water use is actually a lot less than the water that we supply to the network. You can see that all the supplies that we're doing are much less than what the non-residential and residential use is. That is accounting for the amount of water loss. So this slide actually highlights really well how much water loss is occurring in each one of the population divisions. Another key takeaway from here is the water use and side of rural networks is much higher than all the others. This has a lot to do with the mixed rural schemes that are happening, because it's really hard for them to separate residential water use from non-residential water use, accounting for a much larger volume. In comparison, we do have a slide next showing you what the median water use for each population density is. So from this slide, you can see that we're kind of hovering around the 604 liters per connection per day mark. This is actually lower than what we had last year, which was 758 liters per second per day. This was because last year was a comparatively dry year until we had a cyclone. And then this year is a little bit more wet, so we're using a little less water. For an international comparison, if we compared these to Australia, we're pretty similar. So Sydney's around 500 liters per second, no, liters per connection per day, and like Darwin's at 1,000 liters per connection per day. And that has a lot to do with Australia's weather right now, because last year they were wet and now they're really dry. But international comparison, we're actually in the middle. It's good that we're kind of in the middle, but because this range is a median, it doesn't actually show a full picture. If we took the average, as Molly said before, there's a huge skew in the data. So there's numbers ranging in the 7,000s and there's numbers ranging in the 50s. This is kind of the way we want to try to solve this problem, by reducing water loss so these numbers come down, by addressing the outliers, because some of these numbers are really high, and we're going to try to work with the councils to try to fine-tune their information and see if the water loss is actually that extreme. Next slide. So when we are looking at the data, so we had a 59% of operators increase their use. This translated into about 41 network operators actually increasing their volume from last year to this year, whereas 24 operators actually decreased, but it ended up being a net increase overall. There is more water restriction days happening this year compared to last year, 3 times more. And there is the increase in water supply to network by 12%. But a lot of this had to do with different weather events. So a good example would be Wairoa and their issues that occurred after Cyclone Gabrielle. Cyclone Gabrielle hit them really hard. It damaged all their networks, and they had a lot of clean out due to flooding. So they ended up increasing their water consumption by 11 times. So it's really hard to try to find a trend about water use right now, because we have all these outliers that are occurring. Hopefully, while we gather more data, we can start identifying a trend about how the water use is going throughout the sector. Next slide. Finally, pressure management. It's a really integral part about network management to have some sort of pressure monitoring system. This year, we found that those that reported a pressure, operating pressure for their system, the median was around 450 kPa. Unfortunately, 11% of the network operators were operating below the reference pressure that they set themselves. And then another 10% of operators were actually operating under the Fire and Emergency Code of Practice for pressure for firefighting. So that's at 100 kPa. Now, pressure is a very integral part, like I said before, of managing a network, because if we don't have the correct pressure, you can either have too high of a pressure, which causes leakages by overpressurizing the pipe, or too low of a pressure, allowing ingress of contamination. So that's why we really want people to start focusing also on maybe managing pressure on their networks and trying to make sure that they're meeting their targets for it. Next slide. Now, finally, data for finances. So this year's the first year that we collected financial data from all of the network operators. We had a lot of numbers come in. Unfortunately, some of the numbers included things like depreciation and loan repayments. We don't really want that information, so we've changed the measure this year to include a definition saying we really just are focusing on operating costs, so like people, equipment, labor, chemicals, that kind of stuff. Bearing that in mind, we had about a 40% to 60% split between CapEx and OpEx. This does indicate a little bit more CapEx is being a little bit more funding is being put towards operational expenditures, which may indicate that there's a lot of remedial work happening or emergency work happening due to older assets, but because we don't have as much information, this is just a theory. When we're focusing on CapEx, we noted that 26% of the funding has gone to new infrastructure, while 74% of the funding has gone to existing renewals. This does indicate that there may have been some underinvestment inside of the networks prior, so they're just trying to play catch up right now. But again, because we don't have as many financial figures that the Commerce Commission might be collecting when they stand up, this is the assumptions that we can make. The other thing that we want to point out is that although metro spending does have more money, so more money is spent in metro areas, on a per person basis, the rural areas actually have more spend. So on the image on the right, you can see how the difference between the two is. The biggest challenges in rural areas is a larger landmass with a lower rate base. So they have to pay a lot more money per person to try to get the same renewals and things happening for their assets, as opposed to the metro area where there's just an economy of scale. There's a lot more people, you can buy more, and they can reduce the costs. So that's all from me. We hit the next slide.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Yeah.
Excellent presentation, and as a former rural mayor, I look at those figures and go, yes, that now makes a lot of sense to me. It's great to be able to face those comparisons, though. We do have one question, and a reminder for people online, please pop your questions in Q&A. We'll have a break for questions now, and then we'll come back, obviously, at the end for further partai. But Wayne Vent of Palmerston North has asked, the water loss spreadsheet provided by Water NZ is old and difficult to use. It freezes often on his system. It is also locked with background macros, but the layout does not align with their council water supply billing and metering. Is there a plan to update the tool provided to calculate the water loss? I don't even know who to ask, far less how to answer that question. So which one of our panelists would... Ed, do you want to grab that?
I'll take it.
Thank you.
Currently, we're looking into water loss maturity with Water New Zealand. So that is one of the things that we're going to start reviewing. It is in the initial phases right now, so hold tight.
Excellent. All right, well, with no further questions there, we'll move now over to Heather Griffiths, who's going to talk to us about environmental performance. Kia ora, Heather, welcome.
Kia ora koutou, nice to be here, everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about environmental performance and more specifically on some of the resource consent data we collected this year and go on to some of our conclusions and recommendations. Thanks. So yeah, this year we've been able to dig into a bit more detail around the consents involved in drinking water networks, and we have a lot of consents. So overall, there are more than 1,000 consents involved in the drinking water network, and with around 800 or so around just on water take consents. When we drilled into the data a bit more, on water take consents, we found that around 44% will require reconsenting in the next 10 years, and that includes 9% of water take consents that are already expired. So it's clear from this data, as the consents come up for renewal, that ensuring a security of supply will be actively on the mind for many of you, network operators. We know that network operators can continue to operate under expired consents as they go through the process of renewing them under Section 124 of the RMA, but we did note that in the report that there are a few operators that have been operating under expired consents for more than 10 years. We also found, interestingly, this year that of the water take consents, 27 network operators reported they had not always met their consent conditions for the rate or volume of water taken. So that affects 11% of all water takes overall. So that means that network operators are at times either taking more water than is permitted, or they're taking it at a faster rate, or both. But when we did go to look into this data in a little bit more detail, there did seem to be quite a range in how network operators reported when a consent had been exceeded, from very minor exceedances to quite large. So this might be an area that we look at getting a bit more consistency on in future years as well. Next slide, thanks. So similar to drinking water, there's an even larger number of consents for wastewater plants that will require reconsenting in the next 10 years, including around 20% of consents that are already expired. I don't think this will come as a surprise to many of you who have been following the wastewater performance standards that we've recently consulted on, as this large wave of consents was one of the key motivations to get some national consistency in this space. Like drinking water, most of these expired consents will be operating under Section 124 of the RMA, but we noted that an even larger number of wastewater discharge consents have been expired for more than 10 years. So that's the dark red bit on this table here, affecting around 13 consents. We also found that it was more rural and provincial councils that did have these expired consents or operating under Section 124, and we do know too that it can be challenging for these smaller operators to fund the reconsenting process and the time involved for that. So the intent of the wastewater standards is to reduce some of that cost and time that is involved. Thanks. So this graph shows the plants with the highest, what we call tertiary standard of treatment on the left, to the most simplest plants with primary levels of treatment on the right, which shows that the standard of treatment at across plants varies quite considerably across the country. Just 40% of rural and provincial wastewater plants receive the highest standard of treatment compared to 75% in urban areas. Now that might be intuitive because high level of treatments are obviously more needed in more populated areas. However, you can see from the graph that there are still quite a few provincial areas with the lower levels of treatment, and that can vary due to differences in council plans, consent conditions, the volume coming into the plant, but can also depend on where the wastewater eventually goes as well. So moving on to that, this graph shows that most wastewater is discharged onto land or rivers, and because the actual impact of wastewater discharges will depend on the receiving environment that the water is discharged to, the proposed standards set limits depending on where the wastewater goes, with higher standards for those that are more vulnerable to pollution. So I increase over time. The standards will allow for some of these differences, but overall make the level of wastewater treatment more consistent across the country. So in future years, as the standards come into effect, we should see a shift in the data reported to us on wastewater through this report. As many of you will be aware, overflows of untreated wastewater directly into the environment occur quite frequently in New Zealand, and they can occur when the demand on the network exceeds the capacity of that the system can cope with, for example, in periods of high rainfall. Of course, overflows are a key concern for many people as they directly impact on the health of the waterways and can make beaches unsafe to swim or to gather seafood. However, we found that many overflows are unlikely to be consented or monitored, which often relates to the rules set in regional plans as well. So this graph shows that in most places, in most plans, the most common type of consent for overflows is that, well, rather not consent rule for overflows is they're prohibited activities and plans. So that means that consents are often not needed. And managing overflows as a prohibited or permitted activity means that there may be limited requirements to monitor or report or manage the impact of that overflow. And we can see that in some of our other data. For example, we found that for 30% of councils, verbal reports, so reports from people on the ground who have noticed an overflow, were the only type of monitoring, and less than half used real-time SCADA systems that collect information on a real-time basis. So just moving on to the conclusions and recommendations. As Sarah said earlier, it won't be a surprise to many of you that the findings in the report really confirm the critical nature of water infrastructure challenge we face in New Zealand. But we think too that the report also represents a step forward in that it's the first time we've really been able to gather and compile this data together across drinking water and wastewater from so many or almost all network operators across both the state of the infrastructure, resource consent information and financial data into one. And together we think it tells a really interesting story. And being able to look across the data on asset condition alongside the resource consent information means that we can see and think about the risks more broadly than we would be able to if we just looked at one set of that information. So as Sarah pointed out earlier, the report really highlights that around water loss, it's not just the direct financial and environmental costs that are happening now, but it also points to the longer term strategic risks to water security when we look at water loss alongside increasing demand, climate change and risks of water shortages. Also, another really key finding in this report is around the challenge for more rural networks around resourcing and capability, given that water networks are some of the largest costs that operators will face, and there is much fewer people in rural areas that will be able to contribute to maintain the same amount or even more infrastructure in some places. So what this report is really about is about helping to improve the national transparency of these risks, which is both key for us to do our job as a regulator, but also is really important for the public. But not just that, it's also about driving real improvement in network operators' own understanding of their networks and performance, which encouragingly, I think we're already seeing signs of. As many of you will know better than me, the first rule of asset management is to understand your assets. So if there's poor data or information, it's going to be much harder to make good decisions about where to invest and where the greatest risks lie. So that's really what this is about, building that knowledge base to inform better understanding of our risks, better decisions and better long-term planning, so we can move from being more reactive to more proactive. And finally, onto our recommendations. As Sarah said, we acknowledge that we're on a journey, and in the report we've taken on some commitments to ourselves, as well as making recommendations for network operators and councils. As a regulator, we know that there is more that we can do to improve our guidance and processes for reporting to ensure that it's clearly understood and as efficient as possible. As the Commerce Commission is coming in and taking new functions around information disclosure like this, we'll be looking with them to make sure that we remove any duplicate or unnecessary reporting. Also, the new data around resource consents and information this year, we've been starting to share that with regional councils as the other key regulator in this area so that we can better understand the implications across the system as a whole. But alongside our own improvements, we're recommending that operators and network operators actively increase their own understanding of their assets and risks by actively investing in monitoring equipment and data management and processes, as well as providing insurance on the data that they report to us. So what we want to do is continue to see that this reporting is improving year on year. And I think ultimately what we're keen to do is move from a focus from improved reporting to one of actual improved performance, which really points to that third recommendation here, where we're recommending that operators are strategically planning to reduce water loss and ensure a resilient supply. So thank you for your time today. I'll pass back over to Tim for questions.
Thanks very much, Heather. And look, I just absolutely tautoko everything you've said. For me, coming from the position of an elected representative, this time last year I was reading these reports through quite a different lens, but there is nothing that focuses one's attention like seeing where you're falling behind the rest of the country or seeing really clearly ways that you can improve both the environment and the economic efficiency of the water infrastructure that you're governing. And I think one of the things that people in this room may or may not have thought of, I mean, in the broader sense, is with the incoming CCOs, both this report and the drinking water report that we'll be looking at tomorrow, they're going to become Bibles in some regards for those directors as they look at the operations that they're picking up and how they compare and what can be done to make them operate better. We have one question in the Q&A, and just a reminder while we deal with that, there is plenty of opportunity for folks to ask further questions in that Q&A, and we'll be coming to them now. But Muzian, I hope I've got that right, Lane from Palmerston North is asking, as Three Waters related reporting requirements continue to ramp up across agencies like Taumata Arowai, DIA, the Commerce Commission, regional councils, etc., what are your thoughts on using a platform like infrastructure data by Lutra or other to consolidate and streamline reporting? At the moment, we're providing essentially the same data metrics multiple times in slightly different formats, which, as makes sense, creates a lot of duplication and double handling. A shared platform could reduce this burden and improve consistencies across agencies, and keen to hear any comments on this. So, team, who's going to pick that one up? Seems a very good question.
Oh, I'll pick it up. So we already use Lutra and Water Outlook to do the information reporting for the drinking water quality assurance and drinking water rules reporting. We are starting to look into maybe having some sort of methodology of submitting the NEPR data online, but with ComCom standing up after Bill 3 passes, there's going to be some changes with how the measures work. So it's still a moving target right now with a lot of parts that we have to deal with. So we would appreciate a centralized data submission system, but there's a lot of work involved in that. So we just have to partner up with a lot of the different entities. And we're on conversation with them. So we are working with ComCom right now about a lot of information sharing.
Makes good sense. Thanks, Ed, and thanks very much for that question. Well, I see no further other questions coming through, so we'll buy all ourselves a bit of time in the busy water sector that we work. Don't forget, of course, tomorrow many of you have already registered for basically the companion webinar for this one, looking at the drinking water regulation report. So please do join us then. I look forward to seeing many of you again then. And if you found today useful, feel free to tell colleagues about this and get them to join up for tomorrow. But with no further questions forthcoming, we'll simply say mā te wā, and thank you very much to our presenters for a thoroughly informative webinar, and look forward to seeing many folks again tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great day.